My name is Mia McDonald. I'm the Circuit Rider Coordinator and the Training and Outreach Coordinator at the Boston MassDEP Wetlands Program. And I have with me today Rebecca Haney and Nate Corcoran. Rebecca and Nate, do you want to say hi and introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Rebecca Haney. I'm a coastal geologist with the Coastal Zone Management Office. Nate?
Hi, I'm Nate Corcoran. I'm a coastal geologist with MassDEP Wetlands Program in Boston.
Thanks. Well, we'll jump right in. Before Rebecca starts, we're going to go back to the beginning because there's more acrostics than usual, and that's saying a lot for our trainings. So we're going to back it up. We're going to talk about the different zones, the different definitions, give you some examples, and then we'll start getting into some really intricate examples from the FEMA viewer and how to look and identify those zones. So take it away, Rebecca.
Thank you, Mia. So the FEMA has a number of different coastal flood zones for the coastal floodplain. Most of the ones that you've more familiar with in the past have been the V and the A zones, but there's a little bit more subdivision within those zones now. We're going to see more terminology coming in the, you've seen it in the draft land subject to coastal storm flowage regulations, and it's also going to be in the new building code. So it's important to understand the details of what the terminology is, what it means, and how to find it on the flood maps. So the velocity zones are areas of 100-year flood with velocity waves that typically is delineated based on either wave heights of 3 feet or greater, wave run-up depth of 3 feet or greater, or if it's part of the primary and frontal dune, which is the first dune landward of the beach. So that's the VE zone, and the E means that there's elevations determined, and that's the base flood elevation, or the top of the waves. We'll talk about that in the next couple slides. Then you have a zone AE, where you could have either coastal or riverine conditions. You can have up to a 2.9-foot wave height. And the coastal flood elevation, the base flood elevation on the FEMA flood map is at the top of the wave envelope, or the top of the water. Now the AE zone is broken down in coastal areas into a couple different areas now. The moderate wave action area is the area where you have 1.5 to 3 foot waves and moving water predicted. It's also known as the coastal A zone. So in the 10th edition.
Oh, now what?
In the 10th edition building code, that will, when it refers to coastal A zone, that is the same as the moderate wave action area. Then you also, landward of the moderate wave action area, you have the minimal wave action area, where there's less than 1.5 foot breaking waves and possible moving water. These two areas are separated on the FEMA flood insurance rate map by the limit of moderate wave action area. So LIMWA is delineated to show you the extent of the moderate wave action area or coastal A zone, and it is on all the FEMA maps now. It was updated. There was a coastwide map change done in 2017 to update those LIMWAs on all of the Massachusetts maps. So there's also another A zone is the AO zone. That's where you have an overwash area with flow depths of 1 to 3 feet. So all of those flood zones can be seen on the FEMA flood maps. The most up-to-date versions are always found on the FEMA Map Service Center. So I recommend using that. If you just type the FEMA Map Service Center into a browser, that the address will come up quite quickly. But that is where you want to go for to look at the flood maps. So we're going to go to the next slide. Looking at these flood zones in more of a cross section, a typical cross section along shoreline. You have your velocity zone on the seaward side. That's where you have your waves coming in from the ocean. And that landward boundary of the velocity zone is mapped where you change from, going from a 3 foot breaking wave to less than 3 feet, or 3 feet of run up to less than 3 feet of run up. Then you have your coastal A zone or MOA area. It's not going to say coastal A or MOA on the FEMA flood map, but what you will see is that black line with the triangles, that is the LMWA. That is what is on the flood maps to show you the boundary of the MOA and the MIWA. And then landward of the A zones is the X zone, which is outside of the 100-year flood zone or 1% chance flood area. If you look at the couple lines shown here, the 100-year still water elevation is just still water without considering waves. But the FEMA flood maps do have an elevation on them for each zone for the coastal floodplain. That's the base flood elevation, and that's the top of the waves, the top of the water. And so if you think about that water coming in from the ocean, tapering down as it starts to, the waves start to feel the bottom and it's slowing down and lowering in elevation. This is a typical transect with a nice gradual profile. Each place along the coast with different topography, the flood zones are going to look a little bit different. And that's part of what we're going to talk through today with some examples. Next. So this is looking at a slightly different cross section, showing you the waves on top of the still water with that top of the water with the dotted line of coming across there. And it's the same delineation of where you go less than 3-foot breaking waves and you get your boundary between the V and the A. And then your 1.5 to 3-foot breaking waves is your coastal A or MOA. And your MIWA is landward of the 1.5-foot breaking wave where you have the LMWA. So this is just looking at it a little bit differently where you can see the water in the cross section. Next. So the cross sections and our shoreline is varied. You don't always have that nice, gentle sloping, low sloping transect like we saw in the last couple slides. So where the topography is rising more quickly, then the waves are tapering down and the floodwaters are tapering down quicker as well. And so what this can result in as this invisible A zone. So in some cases, you'll see a V zone going directly to X zone. And when we look at that, we say, hold it, you can't just go from 3-foot of waves to nothing. And you don't in reality. There is a transition there. But if that transition is less than 0.2 inches on a FEMA flood map, which is equal to 80 feet on the ground, then they consider it too narrow to map. And so there is actually a transition. You're not missing anything, but it's just not mapped. And so that top of the wave, the elevation 14 for the V zone is what you're going to see in those areas where it's transitioning much more quickly. So, next. So some of the things to think about when you're looking at FEMA flood maps is that these are graphical representations of engineering data. They have done calculations to predict the likely extent of the flood and the elevations of the flood in a 1% chance event, but the detailed analysis is only done at specific transects along the coast. So if you look at this particular area, there's a shore perpendicular dotted line there with a 25. There's a short perpendicular dotted line with a 26 and a 27. Those are the transects along this shoreline. And so they have representative transects. They are relatively widely spaced, in a lot of cases more widely than this. And so the detailed calculations are done at the transects, and then the mappers interpolate the flood zones in between based on topography. So that's a really important point to consider. The effective maps are based on sea level conditions and shoreline position at the time the flood study was conducted. So it's not just the date of the flood maps itself, but the flood study. So the flood insurance study is available in the Map Service Center where I said the flood maps were, and it describes when all the analysis was done. Just as an example, there were some recent updates to some of the coastal counties but there was no new coastal analysis done. It was all inland new analysis. And so you would have to look at when that coastal analysis was done to know when that original wave study was done, and what shoreline position and how long ago that was. So those are just some general things to consider with FEMA flood maps. Next.
I guess to take you through the first example, this is how all the things that Rebecca just described, this is how it looks in the FEMA floodplain viewer, in the online viewer. This example is from North Shore Boulevard in East Sandwich. And so we're going to take a look at this together. Can you guys see my cursor? Yes, okay, good. So we'll start with the white flood zone boundaries. With all the white lines, we've got a white line here, the boundaries between the different flood zones. The LIMWA was represented as a black line with the triangles. We saw that on some of Rebecca's graphics on the previous slide, and this is what it looks like in the viewer. It's a black line with triangles. It really stands out in the viewer. And the triangles point towards the higher hazard area, points towards the MOA, towards the V zone. We can see that each of the zones, zone AE, they have a base flood elevation called out in parentheses beneath them. So this zone AE is elevation 10. Over here, the zone VE is elevation 16. So each one is called out. So I want you to take a look at this LIMWA. You know, we have the VZ out here, the VE zone out here by the water. And as we move landward, you know, our zones are going to be less hazard areas. So over here, we're going from a VE zone with waves over 3 feet to a MOA with waves over 1.5 feet to a MIWA. And remember, the LIMWA usually separates the MIWA from the MOA, with the triangles pointing towards the higher hazard area. In this example, we have an area where the LIMWA up here, can you guys see my cursor up here? Whoops. Click. Up here, we can see the LIMWA is separating the VE zone from the MIWA, because we can follow that MIWA all the way around here. In this case, there is no MOA. The area with no MOA begins where the it appears. And as Becca said earlier, it's not that there isn't. This is due, the reason there's no MOA is due to topography and change in elevation. Where there is no MOA, the elevations are rising more quickly. One more thing about this example is you might notice that the LIMWA often overlaps those white flood zone boundaries. And so it might be a little harder to see those boundaries, like what's underneath. Is there a flood zone boundary here? Is there a flood zone boundary here? In the viewer, you can toggle those on and off. Later in this presentation, we're going to show you exactly where to do it. It's a little buried in the legend on the viewer. We're going to show you how to do that. But for now, we just want to show you what it looks like when you do toggle it on and off. This is the same example, and we've toggled off the LIMWA. So we can see how the LIMWA follows this boundary and then goes up here and follows this sort of mitten boundary. Now it's going to take us through our next few examples.
This is an example on Revere Beach Boulevard in Revere. This is an example that does not have a MOA. So if you start on the seaward side, you see V zone elevation 16. And as you go landward, the LIMWA is pretty close to the beach. This is an area with a seawall. So that seawall is knocking down that wave height. So on the other side of the seawall is an A zone, but because the LIMWA is separating the V zone and the A zone, that means that A zone is the MIWA, and there's no MOA mapped at this site. So you can see that boundary between the V zone and the A zone. You can also see that there's different elevations within that V zone. The most seaward elevation 16. To the northern side, there's V zone elevation 15, and then south of that, there's V zone elevation 14. And these elevations are important to pay attention to because they represent the base flood elevation. Next slide. So this is another example of an area with a seawall. This is in Winthrop Parkway in Revere. So the northern side or northern portion of this site, you can see there's a V zone, and then as you go landward, you hit a limwa, and then you're outside of the flood zone there. This is an example of that invisible A zone that Rebecca mentioned earlier. It's not that the A zone doesn't exist, it's that the wave height drops so fast due to topography that the A zone isn't mapped by FEMA. But as you can see on the southern portion, there is the MIWA. Again, there's no MOA in this area, but the V zone transitions from V zone to MIWA, and it's separated by that limwa line. Next slide. So there are times when the FEMA maps can be changed, and this is a letter of map change. So there are two types of letters of map change. The first is the letter of map amendment, and this is an interpretation of what the current firm depicts for a specific site. So this is taking the data that's already available from FEMA and then a further interpretation of that data for a site. As Rebecca mentioned, the transects they use for interpretation are pretty far apart. So a specific site can be interpreted further between those transects, and sometimes this can result in a change of what's depicted on the map. There's also letter of map revision, and this is a requested change to FEMA based on site-specific analysis. And this is in this revision, more information is submitted to FEMA based off engineering analysis. This happens sometimes, say a property owner thinks that they're not in a flood zone, they submit more information to FEMA and request a letter of map revision. So these letters of map change show up on the FEMA maps, and they should be, so any time an applicant is submitting something and they want to say that they're not in a flood zone or it should be less restrictive, they need a letter of map change from FEMA to support that claim. However, you can use evidence of higher flood elevations. That does not need a map change if there's a record of photographs showing that there's flooding higher than the FEMA flood zone. That can be used to make an area more restrictive. However, anything that's less restrictive than the FEMA flood maps would need a letter of map change. Next slide. So this is an example of what that would look like on the FEMA viewer. So here you can see a V zone depicted. There's V zone elevation 27, and then V zone elevation 22, and then V zone elevation 27 on the left of that. And then at that V zone elevation 22, there's a thing that says LOMR, so that's a LOMR letter of map revision, and it has a date, and it states, and that's when that, so information was submitted, likely by that property owner, to demonstrate that they're not actually in a V zone elevation 27 or whatever it was previously, that it's actually a different flood zone or a different base flood elevation. and it was reviewed by FEMA, and the letter of map revision was issued then. So whenever you encounter this LOMAR or a letter of map amendment, that was the process to get that change. Next slide. Back to me.
Yeah, this is from Black Pond Road in Plymouth. This is a little bit more of a complicated example that you might find in the FEMA viewer. And in this case, we want to show that the LIMWA may not always follow the elevations, but it's actually based on the modeling of the 1.5-foot wave. In this case, we have our V zone out here towards the ocean, and the V zone is creeping in here. You can see these white lines, these flood zone boundaries. And so the V is all the way into here with a VE elevation 15. And this boundary here is separating the V and the A. Down to the south, we can see this flood zone boundary separating the VE from the A zone down here. In the middle, we're kind of left with this donut here, this sort of crescent of an A zone in the middle with a LIMWA separating the A zone. So we have this LIMWA pointing towards the middle. And so we know that the triangles are pointing towards the higher hazard area, and it's dividing the A zone. We know that it's pointing towards the MOA and dividing the MIWA from the MOA. We also have an X zone here. So we can assume that this is from elevation, that this is a higher area, and then we have this unique sort of, for this example, we have this unique little area where we have the V zone and the LIMWA is separating the V and the X. And this is again, one of those cases with those invisible A zones. There's probably an increase in elevation right here that the A zone was too small to be mapped. So there's a lot going on in here, but when you break it down step by step, and if you live in Plymouth, I think this is the Nero, so none of you guys are from Plymouth, but if you have an example like this in your community, because where you're from community, you're going to get to know what these areas look like in your parts of the FEMA viewer. And so if you have an example like that, we will be providing these slides and you can refer back to this to kind of break down what's happening and what you're looking at. Oh, I think in this slide, we also have a good example of a FEMA transect line. And that's just a reminder, sometimes there's lines on here, we're like, wait, what is that again? This is one of those transect lines. And this is where mapping analysis was done. Okay, example 6, we're back to Nate.
This is another complicated example. So starting on the seaward side, you can see there's a V zone. As you go landward, you see that it goes to A zone. And because there's no LIMWA separating that V zone and A zone there, that A zone is the MOA. And then as you go a little further landward past the MOA, you see V zone again. So this is an area of wave regeneration. So during a storm event, this area would be all open water, and the topography dips down a little in that V zone area. So the wave height is likely around 3 feet here, goes below 3 feet, so it's mapped as an A zone, and then due to wave regeneration, it goes back to V zone. And looking around this area, you can see it's separated. The LIMWA covers the whole area, and there are a few areas where the A zone extends past the LIMWA. So those areas would be the MIWA. But it's just an example of, so there can be V zone landward of an A zone. It's just something to look out for, and something that can get a little tricky. Next slide. So now we're going to get into the AO zone. So the AO zone is areas of overwash with flow depths of 1 to 3 feet. So when it's depicted on a map, the AO zone, unlike the other flood zones, doesn't have an elevation. It has a depth. It has a depth from 1 to 3 feet, and that represents the depth of water that's moving with directional flow. So an AO zone occurs often on barrier beaches. So it's an area where the ground is generally sloped and it has water that flows with the depth and with the velocity. So you can see these, like I said, on barrier beaches. And here we have a depiction of what that looks like. So the waves go over, in this case, there's a seawall, and then it flows over that seawall and onto the sloping land. So it's something to look out for in areas with AO zones are channelization of flow. Oftentimes, because this water is moving with a velocity, if there's houses or structures that are close together, you can channelize that flood water and increase the velocity of the flood water. And that's something to look out for when permitting projects in AO zones. And it's something that really want to be avoided. It's not often easy to determine where this channelization will occur. So learning where the flow paths are is important in an AO zone. And in the proposed LSCSF regulations, that AO zone will have the same performance standards as the MOA. Next slide. So here is an example of an AO zone. So this is in Salisbury, which is a barrier beach. So as you can see, there's the V zone on the seaward side, and then the Limois, and then an AO zone. And that AO zone has a depth of 2, so that means there's a depth of 2 feet during the 100-year storm event. And this is an area where, like I mentioned earlier, channelization could occur. You see houses pretty close together, and with that AO zone, that depth of 2 feet of water has a directional flow. In this case, it would be a directional flow towards the landward side of the barrier beach. So when you're looking at a flood map and you see an AO zone, that's what you need to keep in mind. That's a directional flow with the depth of what's listed on the flood map. Next slide. So this is an example of a levee. There aren't too many areas where this occurs in Massachusetts. This example is at New Bedford, and the levee in question is the New Bedford Hurricane Barrier. So as you can see, there's a V zone on the seaward side of this area, and then there's a Limois that corresponds with the New Bedford Hurricane Barrier. And then landward of the Limois, there's an area of gray and orange stripes. So were the hurricane barrier not to exist, this area would be mapped in the flood zone. However, because that barrier stops water from coming in, it is now an area with reduced flood risk due to levee. So that means it's outside of the flood zone because of that barrier. So if you do see an area that's mapped with this orange and gray striping, that's what's occurring. That means there's a levee or barrier that's mapped by FEMA that shows to reduce the landward flooding. And if a levee or something is built and an applicant is arguing, oh, well, now I'm outside the flood zone because I built this levee or this flood barrier, they need to have that mapped by FEMA. You can't just say, oh, I have a levee that's above the base flood elevation. It would need to be mapped by FEMA to show that they're now outside of the flood zone.
Thank you, Nate. Now we're going to take you through some quizzes. So I have to stop sharing and for just a second and get the quiz ready. While I'm getting it ready, we are looking for 2 volunteers. We know many of you, and Alicia knows all of you. So if you don't volunteer, you do risk being called on. So we're looking for some folks to work as a team, take you through kind of like a pin the tail on the gut donkey exercise. I'm just going to get that ready here. We have to open up PowerPoint so that we can manipulate the slides. So I will reshare. Okay, can you all see example 9 quiz? All right. We are looking for 2 volunteers to pin the flood zone on the FEMA example. Any volunteers to work together? All right, I'm going to volunteer Tyler Farrick and his brother Mason. Farrick, you're up. So I think, Tyler, you've done this before. So
Yep.
We're going to go through and you tell me which one you'd like to try, any of these gray labels, and then you kind of give me where you'd like me to put them on the FEMA example. Start with the V zone. Where would you like to put that?
Did you say start with me?
Yep, you and or Mason.
Oh. All right.
Where should we put the V zone?
I'll start it up. Zone VE elevation 23.
Perfect. You agree, Mason?
Yep.
Yep, that's why we do a pair. You guys can help each other out. Okay.
Is the limwa gonna be that black line with the arrows facing
It is.
outward?
Yep. There you go. What else can we label? What about the A zone?
Can do the A zone. That would be right on the left side of the zone AE. Elevation 15 up there.
Right here? That sounds good.
Yeah.
What next?
Is the X zone gonna be outside of that to the left?
In the unshaded area.
And then is the AO zone gonna be zone VE elevation 16?
What do you think, Tyler?
And where did you say it
Overwhelmed.
was?
To the
think-
left is zone V, that middle portion.
Here?
Zone VE, the one just to the right of it.
Right here.
Where do
Yeah.
you see an AO zone there?
Between the, kinda hard to point.
I'll give you a clue. Look north.
Nice. Yeah, it's way up.
Way up, kind of hiding up here.
Gotcha.
The boundary between the V and the A. That is right in between that white line to the right of the zone AE elevation 16.
Right there, right?
Yep. A and the X.
And the X is another white line.
That on the
Alright.
outside to the left of where the zone or the label for zone A is.
Right about here? Yep. All right. Where is our MIWA and our MOA? Remember, the LIMWA separates the MIWA and the MOA in the A zone.
That minimal wave action would just be to the left of the triangle black line.
Mhm. Do we have any MOA on here?
Yes,
Where's the MOA?
right on the right side.
Right over here, right? Yeah, so it's not in this VE zone, but on this, in the A zone, the LIMWA separates the MIWA from.
permits to do a well? Like, would we have any record of a well?
All right. This looks very good. Rebecca, look at you.
Very good.
Very good.
Gold
All
star.
right, good job. Let's look at the answers. Yep, I think you got all of them. Thank you, guys.
No problem.
All right, we have another example. Do we have 2 more volunteers? How about Alicia, would you choose a buddy?
Oh, goodness. Let's see. Who else is here?
I think we're scaring people away.
You're very much scaring me.
Oh, come
How-
on.
How about
Or Nate too.
I think who has the most experience? Lucia, are you up for it?
Sure.
Thank
All right.
you.
Thank you. So start with the simple ones, and there are some tricks on here. If you don't see it, it might
Of
not.
course there are.
I don't have a teammate. It's just me.
No, you
No,
and
it's me.
Alicia.
It's you and me. It's
Oh,
you and me,
cool. Okay,
babe.
good. Well, let's start with the easy one. X zone is the
Where do you wanna-
unshaded where we can see houses.
Awesome.
There you go.
There you go.
All right.
And-
The V zone would be the area that says VE.
Out here.
The limwa is that little jagged line pointing towards the sea.
There you go. With the triangles.
The A zone is where is this area where it says AE 15
Mhm. Okay, it's down here.
down there. Yeah.
I'll go for the other easy one. The boundary between A and X is that little white line, like near where it says Scituate, I think.
Right there.
Yep, yep.
All right. I'm gonna be bold and say the Miwa is the area like the outside of the Limwa, like where it says town of Situate, that would be the Miwa, where it's in the floodplain, but it's outside of the Limwa.
Mhm. That's right. And then maybe start with this one, the flood zone between V and A. Where's the flood zone between V and A?
Is it that little dotted sort of 2 dots, 1 long line? No,
No, it's
no.
close. So that is, we had really had to figure out what that was. And this example is to help people to understand. That is what kind of FEMA kind of considers the coast. It doesn't really mean anything, and you can't toggle it off. We openly ignore it. And then the line between V and A, any guesses where we should send this arrow?
Looks like
Gotta
it's
be-
hidden.
I think it's hidden. That's exactly what I was thinking. I think it's
Yeah.
hidden
It's in under the
under
Limwa.
the Limwa.
Limwa, which
Yeah,
means
looks
that
good.
Limwa is separating the V and the A. And when the Limwa separates the V and the A, then that means there is no
MOA.
MOA.
That's what I thought. I was like, that was what I was gonna say. So
Yep. This is a tricky one. Here's the
Good
example.
job.
No MOA. Okay, so Limwa separates. And then we want to bring up what is this line? This line.
Yep.
Rebecca, do you have any comments about this line?
It's a boundary that they're using the proxy for shoreline or some of their baseline for analysis. Just ignore it.
Mhm. Okay, we have one more example. Oh no, before we get into the example, we want to show you how to toggle the limwa. Before we get to our last one. So when you are in the viewer, you open the layer list with its stack of diamonds. When you open it, it's going to show you that the NFHL, the National Flood Hazard Layer. You have to click the drop down, the little triangle that was once used to be pointing at it. Now you have to point it down and open this drop down menu. When you open the drop down menu, you actually have to scroll down a little bit. And way down at the bottom, not the very bottom, you'll see the LIMWA. And you can toggle that on and off. So I did a little overlay here where the northwest, you can see the LIMWA. And when you toggle that off, you can see that white flood zone line. Okay, this is our last quiz. This is from Rockport. You guys should be experts. Any Rockport experts here? No. All right, Alicia, who should we choose? I think, Alicia, you choose one person from the group, and then that person, you can choose Rebecca or Nate as your partner.
Did you say me?
No, Alicia. Alicia, who should we pick on? Oh, I wonder if Alicia's there. Maybe not. All right, so I'm going to pick Allison McKay. Allison, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
All right, would you Nate or Rebecca to help you?
Okay, so I'm in Amesbury, so I have a little bit of coastal, but I've never
Oh.
had any coastal experience before because I worked for the town of North Andover. So this is all new to me. It's interesting.
Good, good.
I will see what I can do.
All right, you want Nate or Rebecca to help you?
Yeah, let me start. Go with the easy. X zone is where, you know, there's vegetation outside of the flood.
Very good.
Okay.
What
Did you
about
want to
the
help
V?
Allison out as well? If you're interested?
Yeah, who's helping me?
Rebecca, you want to help her?
Yeah, so if you look at the map, look at some of the flood labels you already see on the map and use those as your cues.
Oh yeah, I can do it. I just thought I was partnering with somebody. But
Yeah.
I can try to, okay. So the
Yep.
V zone will be, you know, anywhere where we have VE.
Yep.
About here.
Yep.
There you go.
Okay.
So I just want to see if I have a partner.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I'm helping you.
Okay.
So do you see any A labels on the map?
Well,
On
I
the A
can
zone?
do it, but I thought I was going back and forth with somebody. Is that not the case?
It's just you and Rebecca, Allison.
Here, Rebecca,
I'm
you want to
just
take the
helping.
label?
Yeah, so if you I can take one of these. So your FEMA V and X boundary is going to be the boundary between where you have the shaded blue and the vegetation. So your shaded blue is your flood zones, and outside of that is the X zone.
My arrow disappeared.
And then the Limois is the black line with the, yeah, I don't know how to describe it.
Triangles.
The
The black line with
triangles.
the triangles. Yep.
Yep. And this is another trick question because in this case, we don't see any A labels on the map. There's no A zone labels. And so we're going straight from V zone to X zone. So there is not an A zone.
Right.
And then so where the Limois coincides with the VX boundary, there's no A, there's no MOA, and there's no MIWA.
Right.
But we
And
do
there's
have a loamer.
so we do have a LOMAR there. You see where the LOMAR is?
Remind
Allison?
me again of what Lomar is?
The letter of map revision
Right,
has
okay,
has
yep.
that label right on there.
Yep.
I think we got everything.
Yeah, and that's an area where the additional analysis. You can see you've got a VE 34 to the left and a VE 34 to the east, and then in the middle we have a VE 23, elevation 23. So additional analysis was done on this segment.
There's no MOA.
Correct.
No,
No
no A.
No A at all. So there's no MOA, no MIWA. Those are both parts of the A, and there's no A here.
Got it. Thank you. This is so
Got it.
helpful.
It is. This is good. Thank you.
And you
It's
think of
part
those steep, oh, go ahead, Rebecca.
Yep, we're pulling you in to get you to think it through, because it's one thing to just watch it and listen to it, but to actually look at a map and start to think through the different scenarios, there's a benefit to doing that in the learning process and trying to figure out how this all applies to the maps, because we have such a varied topography along the coastline. This area has very high rocky bluffs, and so it's very steeply rising topography, and it's very different. So we really appreciate the volunteers.
Yeah, thank you so much. And then Rebecca's going to take us through a few more slides.
So once you've identified the flood zones on the maps, delineating on the plans or reviewing delineations of flood zones on the plans is also something you need to be familiar with. So when you're looking at the zone A X boundary or the VX boundary, and this is going to be the landward extent of your 1% chance floodplain, you should be using the ground elevation to figure out where that line is, not just scaling the line off of the map or overlaying it onto the plan the way it's overlaid on an aerial photo here. And so using best available data, whether that's site survey or LiDAR topography, you put the flood zone elevation at that ground elevation. So for the A zone, these A zones in the picture where you go from zone A elevation 15, they're in the middle, to a white line that then goes to the shaded orange area, which is a 500-year floodplain. To find that white line between those two on the ground, you would take that elevation 15 and put that white line at elevation 15 ground contour. And so that is slightly different than the way you would do it for a VA boundary. So if we go to the next slide, when you're looking at a VA boundary, then that is a condition or a situation where you have a high water elevation. It's not going to correspond to a ground elevation, so it does need to be scaled onto the plan. It's the same for the LMWA. You also scale that onto the plan. And so there's a detailed explanation of these techniques and the differences between them in the coastal manual, which is cited here on the slides. I'm not reading the long title, but most of you are familiar with the Applying the Mass Wetlands Regulations, the Practical Guide for Concom's Protecting Storm Damage Prevention and Flood Control Functions. It's important to be able to delineate that flood zone on the ground and make sure that the applicants delineated it correctly. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to look at an example of a portion of a site plan, and they put the A zone, X zone boundary, this dashed line here to delineate the boundary between those flood zones. Yes, that line right there. And if you look at those, the topography, this is the landward boundary of the floodplain, so it should be at a ground elevation. So the landwardmost flood zone is the VE 15, so it should be at elevation 15 on the ground. And in this case, yes, that's the elevation 15 contour, and they didn't do that in this case. So this is one where it should be shifted to that line. So this guidance is for the purposes of site plan review, for Concom's local officials. This is not for flood insurance determinations or mortgage determinations for flood zones. So I'll clarify that, but that's an example of what you need to be looking for, whether it's the landwardmost boundary to put at the elevation, or one of the intermediary boundaries between B and A to scale onto the map. And if we go to the next, we are happy to take questions, and there are no silly questions. We're happy to answer any questions about what we presented today.
You can raise your hand or feel free to unmute if you have any questions. We know we gave you a lot of information. Not seeing any hands. I do want to share with you quickly, if you're thinking of questions, we'll come back to it, is that we are about to release some coastal flood outreach materials. They're actually already available on the web, but they haven't been formally, we haven't done our formal press release yet for them, but these are out there. If you look at our wetlands information, climate resilience section of our website, there's a fantastic story map, a poster, and video. The video is a 7-minute video. It's just lovely with interviews of people from the area that live on the coast. And there's brochures that are available in English, Arabic, Spanish, and Portuguese. There's 2 brochures, each of them available in all 4 languages. The first one is, what is a coastal floodplain? Am I in the coastal floodplain? And then the second brochure talks about the pressures that our coastal floodplains are under. And these are written for lay people. These are things that if you live in a coastal community, maybe you want to have these in your office, because this is for homeowners and lay people. I'm going to put our contacts back up. Any questions?
Are these slides going to be available to us? Awesome.
Yes, Alicia
Thank you.
can email them out to you. And we're going to have them on the website. Again, we're also going to try to have the recording that we're having today. In fact, I'm going to stop the recording now.
So I'll give you another tip while we're waiting for people to think of questions. You also want to think about, when you're looking at flood maps, if you have flooding sources coming from 2 different directions, you want to think about where the flood's coming from. So if, for example,